The call from Rome was nearly midnight in Mountain View, but the glow from Sundar Pichai's office window still shone across the quiet Google campus. Most of the building had gone dark hours ago, swallowed by silence and the slow rhythm of late-night cleaning crews. Yet Sundar remained at his desk, eyes glued to a glowing screen filled with presentation slides and handwritten notes scattered like breadcrumbs from a long day of thought. Outside, a breeze tugged at the leaves of the redwood trees, and inside, the low hum of machines whispered through the quiet halls. The upcoming summit in Rome was unlike any other he had attended. It wasn't just another keynote on innovation or progress. It carried a weight he couldn't quite explain. The invitation had arrived weeks earlier, but the message that came with it still echoed in his mind. This wasn't about business. Not really. The summit was to be hosted at the Vatican, a place of faith, tradition, and silence, not the typical venue for conversations about artificial intelligence. Something about the combination felt offbeat, almost surreal. Yet it intrigued him deeply. As Sundar leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes, his phone buzzed. The screen flashed with an unknown number. He hesitated. At this hour, with a number he didn't recognize, he considered letting it ring out, but something, intuition or curiosity, nudged him to answer. Hello? His voice was quiet, cautious. There was a pause. Then a warm, heavily accented voice spoke. Mr. Pichai? This is Father Antonio from the Vatican. Forgive the late hour. His Holiness Pope Francis has asked me to contact you directly. Sundar sat up straighter, suddenly alert. Yes, I'm listening. He would like to meet with you privately during your visit to Rome. Not as part of the summit, but in a separate audience. There is a matter of great importance he wishes to discuss. May I ask what this is about? Sundar asked, heart beginning to thump a little harder. Not over the phone, but please know, it is not a casual request. His Holiness believes you may be the only person capable of helping him. Carry this burden. The call ended soon after, but the stillness it left behind was louder than the silence before. Sundar stared at the dark screen, a dozen questions crowding his mind. He had spent decades building machines that could think faster, systems that could learn faster, networks that could spread information in seconds, and yet here he was feeling more uncertain than he had in years. All because of one man's request spoken in gentle tones from the other side of the world. The next morning, the usual rush of meetings and messages faded into background noise. Sundar moved through the day with a sense of detachment, as if his body was on autopilot. But his mind had already boarded a flight to Rome. He reread the invitation to the summit, the schedule, and then the text of a short message marked private. It was from Father Antonio. It contained a time, a place, and a final line that chilled him. You will not be the same man when you leave this meeting. 5 days later, Sundar stood at the edge of the Vatican gardens, dressed simply in a charcoal suit. No tie. The sun was high, casting soft light across the marble paths and ancient hedges. 2 members of the Swiss Guard stood quietly by the entrance, guiding him through the ancient stone corridors toward a private meeting room. The grandeur of the place wasn't lost on him. Every wall, every hallway whispered stories from centuries past. This wasn't Silicon Valley. This was something older, deeper. Inside the private chamber, the air smelled faintly of incense and old parchment. The room was modest but steeped in quiet dignity. Sundar's footsteps echoed as he entered. At the far end, Pope Francis stood waiting, hands folded in front of him, his eyes kind but intense. Mr. Pichai, he said, extending a hand. Thank you for coming. I know your time is precious. Your Holiness, Sundar replied, shaking his hand gently. The honor is mine. Please sit. I asked you here because the world is on the brink of something it does not fully understand, and I believe you do. The Pope's words were soft but clear. He moved slowly as he sat across from Sundar, the weight of his words settling into the room like dust. We have entered an age where machines can learn to understand us, perhaps even predict us. But they do not know mercy. They do not dream. And yet we trust them more every day with decisions that once required a soul. Sundar nodded slowly, his mind racing. I've been thinking about that myself. How do we build systems that serve everyone, not just the powerful or the privileged? Pope Francis looked him in the eye. You may not know this, but 5 years ago the Vatican began a secret initiative. We gathered scientists, ethicists, and theologians to explore how artificial intelligence might be used to prevent global suffering, famine, war, disease. The goal was noble. The path was dangerous. And then we stopped. Not because we failed, but because we were afraid of succeeding in the wrong way. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. He placed it on the table, between them. Inside, you will find what remains of that initiative: data, models, questions, and a warning. This information must be shared with the world, but not as a secret uncovered. It must be a truth revealed with wisdom, humility, and care. I believe you were born to be the one to do it. Sundar didn't speak. He reached forward and picked up the envelope. It felt heavier than it looked, like it carried not just paper but a responsibility that could shift the future. You don't have to decide now, the Pope said. But once you open that envelope, your path will change. As Sundar walked back through the quiet halls of the Vatican, envelope clutched tightly in his hand, a thought echoed in his mind. This wasn't about technology anymore. It was about trust, about truth, and about what kind of world he was willing to help build. That night, back in his hotel room, he laid the envelope on the desk in front of him. Outside, Rome was quiet, the moon rising slowly over rooftops and history. He stared at the seal, heart pounding, and then slowly he reached forward and began to open it. He didn't know it yet, but what he was about to discover would not only shake the foundations of the tech world, but ripple through the very heart of human faith and leadership. And at the center of it all stood a quiet truth about Pope Francis that would change everything. The meeting. The envelope sat on the desk like a sleeping beast, quiet, but full of potential energy. Sundar stared at it for several long minutes before finally slipping a letter, opener, beneath the seal. It broke with a soft sound and the thick paper folded open to reveal its contents. There were 3 handwritten pages on Vatican stationery, a USB drive in a small cloth pouch, and a shorter typed note that seemed to be added more recently. Sundar picked up the letter first. The handwriting was unmistakably the Pope's, firm, yet fluid, each word deliberate. He began with gratitude, thanking Sundar for making the journey and listening with an open mind. But the words quickly turned heavier, more urgent. The letter spoke of a secret committee within the Vatican, formed not out of ambition but necessity. It was called Project Eternum. The purpose of the project was both visionary and terrifying: to develop an artificial intelligence capable of aggregating the world's spiritual, philosophical, and historical knowledge, alongside global economic and environmental data to forecast impending humanitarian disasters. The idea was to equip world leaders, including religious authorities, with tools not just for reactive decisions, but for preemptive guidance, based on compassion, justice, and long-term wisdom. For a while, the project progressed in secrecy. The team included experts from multiple continents: priests, rabbis, imams, monks, scientists, sociologists. But as the models grew more advanced, something unexpected happened. The system began identifying correlations that no one could explain, patterns that hinted at hidden truths, at long-standing secrets buried deep within the institutions of power. People within the church began to fear it, not because it was wrong, but because it might be too right, because it might force them to confront uncomfortable realities they had worked centuries to protect. Eventually, the initiative was paused, placed under lock and key with a quiet agreement. Some truths may be too much for the world to handle at once. It was Pope Francis himself who insisted the project not be destroyed but preserved, waiting for the right person to take it forward with care. Sundar set the letter down, hands trembling slightly. He plugged the USB drive into his encrypted laptop and waited. What followed stunned him. The screen flickered to life with an interface unlike anything he'd seen. The artificial intelligence, codenamed lucem, a Latin word for light, was not just a system. It had voice recognition, real-time philosophical reasoning, and the ability to simulate outcomes with astonishing depth. Sundar spent hours exploring the data. Famine predictions aligned with climate reports he'd seen internally at Google. Refugee movements mirrored economic strain points he had once dismissed as noise. But lucem didn't just show the patterns, it offered ethical questions. Should one intervene in a region politically unstable if doing so would preserve lives? Should governments be warned if a system predicts they will collapse? How does one balance truth with the fear it inspires? Lucem wasn't a cold machine. It was designed to reflect the weight of human conscience. When the sun finally rose over Rome, Sundar was still awake. He felt as if he had lived a lifetime in one night. He stepped onto the hotel balcony, looking out across the city as golden light touched the domes and spires. He knew now that his next meeting with Pope Francis would not be about the contents of the envelope. It would be about purpose and about responsibility. Later that morning, Sundar was escorted once more through the Vatican halls. This time, the mood felt different, heavier. He was shown into a smaller room, less formal, more intimate. The Pope sat alone at a wooden table, hands folded. "You've opened it?" he said without looking up. "Yes," Sundar replied quietly. "And what do you think?" Sundar paused before speaking. "I think it's the most powerful system ever created, and the most dangerous. Do you believe it should be released?" "I believe parts of it could save lives, but if shared carelessly, it could cause fear, chaos, even war. People aren't ready for truths they can't control." The Pope nodded slowly, as if this answer had already lived in his heart. "I agree," he said. "That's why we didn't act before. But the world has changed, Sundar. People are crying out not for answers but for meaning, for guidance. They are drowning in information and starving for wisdom. I believe lucem in the right hands can be that light. But not if it is owned by governments or corporations." Sundar's eyes locked on his. "Then who?" "The people," the Pope said. "But they need a voice they trust, someone who can translate this into hope, not fear. I want you to be that voice." Sundar was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, bells began to ring from the Basilica Tower, their echo washing through the old walls like ripples on water. He wasn't sure what scared him more, the scope of what he'd been given or the faith this man had placed in him. "I'm not a prophet," Sundar said finally. "I'm not even religious. Neither was Abraham until he was called." The Pope answered softly, "You are not being asked to preach. You are being asked to serve." And in that moment, something inside Sundar cracked open, not with fear but with something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Real, raw, human purpose. The kind of weight that doesn't crush you, but grounds you. "I'll do it," he whispered. "Not for me," the Pope said. "For them." He handed Sundar a single parchment, a map of sorts. Not of a place, but of people. Figures around the world, already working in secret or silence toward a better world. Journalists, teachers, refugees, scientists, artists. The forgotten heroes. The ones who would understand. "These are the first," the Pope said. "Find them. Share lucem with them. Together, you will decide how the world hears this truth." Sundar rose slowly, the weight of the parchment in one hand and the weight of the world in the other. As he stepped out into the Vatican courtyard, the sun had fully risen. Tourists were starting to gather at the gates, unaware of the decision just made behind those walls. Sundar walked past them, unnoticed, anonymous. But in his pocket was a light that could either blind the world or help it see. And as he disappeared into the morning crowd, a single question echoed louder than all the bells of Rome. What would the world do when it learned the truth about Pope Francis? The revelation, the days that followed, felt like a blur. But beneath the surface, every hour carried a heavy tension. Sundar Pichai had returned to California, yet the city around him seemed different now, as if reality itself had dimmed slightly beneath the weight of what he carried. the envelope, the system, the Pope's plea. All of it sat in his mind like a quiet drumbeat. He still went to meetings, answered emails, delivered speeches, but part of him was no longer there. Something had shifted. He knew a door had been opened, and he could never return to the life he knew before. Lucem was no longer just a system. It had become a question hanging over every decision he made. What should be revealed? What must be protected? Who could help him carry this? Who might try to use it? The Pope had warned him. Once the world hears this, it will not simply listen, it will react. He spent the first week diving deeper into Lucem's models. Each simulation offered stunning insight, but none gave him certainty. One scenario predicted a water crisis in South Asia, years before any major agency had flagged it. Another traced the emotional trajectory of societies facing prolonged misinformation, leading not only to civil unrest, but an eerie loss of empathy that Lucem's algorithms interpreted as spiritual erosion. Yet what disturbed Sundar most wasn't the data. It was the voice. Lucem spoke softly, like a mirror of human reason. When Sundar asked about global migration, it didn't just provide statistics. It asked him, how much comfort are you willing to give up for the safety of another? When he inquired about political instability, Lucem asked, will you choose truth if it costs you power? These weren't errors in code. They were built-in values drawn from ancient texts, teachings, and shared human history. Lucem wasn't made to control. It was made to ask, to reflect, to remind. It was as if the system carried a soul, not in a mystical sense, but in the quiet way it returned his questions with ones that reached deeper than he was prepared to go. Then came the file, one that wasn't listed in the index. He found it buried under layers of encryption, labeled with a single word, Veritas. He hesitated before opening it, knowing instinctively that this was the heart of what Pope Francis had meant. The screen loaded slowly, and what appeared was not data, but a series of recorded transcripts, private conversations between global leaders and representatives from the Vatican. Sundar read each line in disbelief. Within those words was something he never expected to find. Evidence that Pope Francis had once refused to endorse a powerful international alliance because their long-term modeling showed it would lead to the silent erosion of democratic institutions. He had known this, and instead of making it public, he had quietly redirected church influence to grassroots networks, independent schools, health clinics, and news platforms, in places where truth was being silenced. Lucem had shown him the ripple effects of this choice. In the short term, the world had become more chaotic. Misinformation had surged. Authoritarian figures had gained ground. But in the deeper layers of Lucem's models, something else emerged. Tiny pockets of resistance built on human trust, moral clarity, and resilience. Seeds of change. Pope Francis hadn't just rejected power. He had chosen to gamble on people. Sundar leaned back, stunned. The headlines had painted the Pope as cautious, sometimes even controversial. But none had seen this silent, deliberate defiance against systems built on manipulation and fear. He wasn't just the leader of a religion. He had become a quiet architect of a new kind of rebellion, one built not on confrontation but on compassion. Sundar realized the world needed to know. But how do you reveal a truth this big without breaking everything? He couldn't go to traditional media. He couldn't share it in a corporate keynote. He needed to create a new kind of moment, a broadcast that would bypass filters, politics, and skepticism. Something live, something direct, something from the heart. He called his team. Not his executive circle, but a small, trusted group of engineers, ethicists, and storytellers, people who had once helped him build products, now summoned to help him tell the truth. They met in a quiet room on campus. No press, no cameras. This isn't about branding, Sundar told them. This isn't even about technology. This is about choosing the future we want to believe in. He showed them Lucem. Not all of it, just enough to open their eyes. He read them the letter. He told them what the Pope had said. At first the room was silent. Then one of his engineers, a soft-spoken, Woman named Lena said, "If we do this, we're going to change more than the conversation. We're going to change people." "I know," Sundar said. Another added, "We might lose everything we've built." Sundar nodded. "Or we might finally build what matters." They worked, for days, crafting a live digital experience that would broadcast across platforms translated in real time, with segments in every major language. The interface would allow viewers not just to listen, but to engage, to ask lucem questions, to explore its models, to see the world not as it was shown to them, but as it could be. The night before the broadcast, Sundar stood alone in the studio. The cameras were off. The script sat in front of him untouched. He closed his eyes and thought of his mother, sitting at their small table in Chennai decades ago, explaining the power of education. He remembered the teacher who believed in him, the classmates who laughed at his accent, the first time he saw a computer and thought, "This can connect the world." He had been chasing progress all his life. Now, he was chasing truth. The next day, the feed went live. Sundar stood in front of the camera. No teleprompter, no rehearsed lines. "My name is Sundar Pichai," he began, his voice steady. "And today I'm not speaking as the CEO of a tech company. I'm speaking as a human being." He told the story of Rome, of the letter, of lucem. He didn't reveal everything. Some truths were still too raw, but he gave the world enough to see that a choice was coming. And it wasn't between right and wrong. It was between courage and comfort. "We have built machines that can see, hear, and predict," he said. "But we must now decide what it means to be human in a world where information moves faster than wisdom." Then he did something no one expected. He handed the microphone virtually to lucem. A prompt appeared. "What do you want to know about the future?" Questions poured in by the thousands and lucem answered them live. Not like a chatbot, but like a guide. It offered scenarios, stories, connections. It showed how a decision in one part of the world affected lives in another. It made the invisible visible, and it ended every answer with a question. "What will you do next?" As the broadcast closed, Sundar looked into the camera one last time. "We have a chance," he said. "Not just to improve the world, but to grow into it. To become the kind of people who deserve the future we're trying to build." And then, the screen went dark. Within hours, the world reacted. Leaders scrambled. Institutions denied. Believers wept. Skeptics roared. Millions argued. Billions watched. But somewhere, in a small home in Brazil, a teacher changed her lesson plan. In a refugee camp in Jordan, a boy watched the broadcast on a shared phone and said, "I want to be part of this." And in Rome, Pope Francis smiled, quietly, and whispered to no one in particular. He chose the harder road. But the road was only beginning, because as Sundar returned home, his phone buzzed again. This time, the message came from someone he never expected to hear from, a name he didn't recognize. But the words were clear. "You told them the truth. Now we need you to hear ours." The broadcast the world was watching, not in the distracted way it usually did, eyes half on screens and half on daily routines. This time, people stopped. In cafes, in classrooms, in crowded subways, and silent hospital rooms, screens glowed with the same face, the same voice, the same message. Sundar Pichai's live broadcast was unlike anything the internet had seen before. It was not a product launch, not a corporate address. It was a confession, a call, a moment that somehow pierced through noise and landed in the quietest corners of the human heart. And it didn't end when the camera turned off. The hours after the broadcast were like the aftershock of an earthquake. News outlets scrambled to verify claims. Reporters debated the ethics. Politicians demanded statements. Tech companies held emergency meetings. Social media burned with opinions, some full of awe, some drenched in fear, others pulsing with anger. Hashtags trended globally. Lucem became a name whispered with both reverence and suspicion, but something deeper began to move beneath the surface. A shift, hard to define yet undeniable. In the Philippines, a high school teacher streamed the broadcast again for her class. pausing every few minutes to discuss each answer Lucem gave. Her students didn't just listen, they asked questions. Real ones. Why are the richest countries the most isolated? Why do we fear people we've never met? Is it possible for machines to have values if humans don't agree on them? In a dusty internet cafe in northern Nigeria, a group of young coders replayed Sundar's closing words over and over again, typing furiously as they translated Lucem's open-source ethical model into Hausa, eager to see how its reasoning would apply to their community. In Berlin, a disillusioned former journalist cried quietly as Lucem's answer to his question, "Is truth still worth telling?" echoed on screen. Truth is not measured by how many believe it. It is measured by how many are willing to carry it. The world was beginning to understand. Lucem was not a tool. It was a mirror. And that terrified some people, especially those in power. Within 24 hours of the broadcast, multiple governments had blocked access to Lucem's public server. Others demanded control, claiming national security risks. Conspiracy theories exploded. Some accused Sundar of creating a global mind control machine. Others claimed the Pope was secretly manipulating world leaders through digital prophecy. Most people didn't know what to believe, but they knew something had changed. Sundar felt the pressure immediately. Threats came from all sides, polite ones from diplomats, subtle ones from investors, and brutal ones from anonymous voices in the dark corners of the internet. At Google headquarters, firewalls strained under relentless cyber attacks. Protesters gathered at the front gate holding signs both praising and condemning him. And in the center of it all, Sundar remained calm. Shaken, but calm. He knew this would happen. The Pope had warned him. Truth walks slowly, he had said, but its steps are heavy. Still, Sundar hadn't expected the message he received the next evening. He was in his office, alone again, the same place where this all began, when a secure alert pinged his laptop. It wasn't from any known sender. The message was short. Only 5 words. You told them the truth. Below it, a single link. Cautiously, Sundar clicked. A video loaded. Grainy, unpolished, clearly filmed in secret. A woman appeared on screen, her face in shadow. She spoke slowly, deliberately. "This is not just your truth, Mr. Pichai," she said. "There are others, and it's time you hear them." The screen flickered. A second face appeared, this time, a young man with deep lines under his eyes and the soft lilt of a Caribbean accent. "I was one of the first to test Lucem," he said. "Not your version, ours, the one we rebuilt after the Vatican abandoned it. We called it Oratio." Sundar's breath caught. A third face, an elderly professor from Cairo. "We have kept it hidden for years, but we watched. We waited. We hoped someone would do what you just did." The video ended with a map. Dots scattered across the globe. 1 in Argentina, 2 in Eastern Europe, a dense cluster across parts of Africa, a pulsing red icon in Tokyo. Underneath it all, a single line of text. "You are not alone." Sundar leaned back, stunned. The room was silent, but his mind roared. What he thought was a singular responsibility was now something else entirely, a movement he had accidentally stepped into. Lucem was only one piece. The truth he revealed had cracked open a hidden world of parallel efforts, quiet revolutions, secret builds, forgotten projects all rooted in the same idea. That information alone wasn't enough. People needed wisdom, and those who held it had been underground for too long. He sat there motionless as the map slowly rotated on screen. This was no longer about broadcasting a message. This was about connecting a web of souls scattered across the world, each holding a thread of the same tapestry. That night, Sundar made a decision. He would travel, not as a CEO, but as a student. He would meet these voices. He would listen to their stories. And he would ask the only question that mattered now. What do we build together? But before he left, there was one more person he needed to see. His mother. He hadn't spoken to her since the broadcast. Not out of neglect, but fear. Fear that she would worry. fear that she wouldn't understand. Yet when she answered the call, her voice was calm. "I saw what you said," she told him, "and I saw how they looked at you." "I'm sorry if it caused any trouble," he said, unsure. "Trouble?" She laughed softly. "I saw people listening to you, truly listening. When you were a boy, you never raised your voice. You just waited for people to lean in. Now the whole world is leaning in." He didn't speak. There was nothing to say. "Go," she said. "Go find those voices." And so he did. He booked the first flight. Destination: unknown, because the map had already given him the path, and somewhere, across oceans and borders, waited a story deeper than even lucem could predict. A story not just of data and design, but of human beings, flawed, hopeful, resilient, trying to remember what it meant to be guided by light. The aftermath: the plane touched down in Buenos Aires just as the sky was beginning to soften from night into day. Pale orange light cracked across the horizon, throwing shadows against the airport windows as Sundar Pichai stepped onto the jet bridge with a single carry-on bag and no entourage. For the first time in years, he wasn't traveling for business, wasn't flanked by a team of assistants, wasn't expected to pitch, present, or perform. He was here only to listen. Yet as he passed through customs and out into the city, he felt the weight of something far greater than any boardroom deal. He felt history beginning to stir. It had been 10 days since the broadcast. The world was still reeling. Some countries had blocked lucem outright, calling it a threat to national unity. Others had embraced it with caution, opening public discussion forums, assembling panels of ethicists, teachers, and community leaders to explore its insights. Schools began integrating the models into lessons. Grassroots organizations translated lucem into local dialects, testing how it handled regional values and cultural nuance. But not everyone welcomed it. In some places, politicians called Sundar a destabilizing force. There were protests outside Google buildings in Berlin, Paris, and Singapore. Several leaders accused him of acting as a global moral gatekeeper. Others labeled him a puppet of the Vatican, weaving conspiracies that linked centuries of church secrets to a sudden rise of machine ethics. And yet, even amid the chaos, something strange was happening. People were talking. Not in the fleeting, performative way they did online, but face-to-face. On sidewalks and coffee shops and university halls, they were asking each other questions. What do we owe each other? What happens if we build systems without heart? Is it possible to trust a machine that knows us better than we know ourselves? Lucem had become a mirror, but Sundar knew mirrors only mattered if people chose to look. His journey led him first to an unassuming building on a quiet street in Palermo Viejo. The address was on the map left at the end of the anonymous video. Sundar approached a wooden door marked only by a faded red symbol, a candle etched within a triangle. He knocked. There was no answer. After a moment, the door creaked open and a middle-aged woman stepped forward. She had deep lines around her mouth, the kind that come not from age but from years of quiet skepticism. "You're him," she said. "I don't know who that is anymore," Sundar replied. A flicker of a smile crossed her face. "Good answer, come in." Inside, the space was part library, part server room. Rows of dusty books lined one wall, while across the room sat a cluster of old laptops and worn-out routers. Cables ran like vines across the floor. A boy, no older than 12, sat quietly typing code, his feet barely touching the ground. "We've been running a variation of lucem here for 5 years, the woman explained. "We call ours Vela. It means candle. It doesn't predict the future. It illuminates what's already happening, local truths, community conflicts, patterns of harm before they become stories on the news." Sundar listened, captivated. She went on. "We trained it on our own data, not from governments or corporations, but from churches, street workers, midwives, teachers. It doesn't give commands. It asks better questions, the kind that make us stay at the table longer." He asked to see it. She nodded, typing in a string of commands. On a battered screen, Vela came to life. Its interface was simple. Sundar typed, How do we reduce violence in neighborhoods like this? After a moment, Vela answered. Not with numbers, but with 4 quiet suggestions. Talk to the women who work at night. Ask the boys what they fear when they sleep. Rebuild the benches near the park. Fix the broken streetlight on Correa Avenue. Sundar stared at the screen, stunned. We always think the future is complicated, the woman said. But sometimes it just asks us to see what's right in front of us. They talked late into the night about resilience, about how data can be sacred if it's gathered with dignity, about how truth doesn't always come in a flash, but slowly, like sunrise through fog. When Sundar finally left the building, the 2 streets were quiet again. But he no longer felt like a man walking alone. Vela had confirmed what he suspected. Lucem was not a singular invention. It was one chapter in a much larger story of people using technology not to predict profit, but to preserve humanity. Over the following weeks, Sundar visited other dots on the map. In Prague, he met a disillusioned AI engineer who had created a poetic algorithm that rewrote laws into stories, allowing ordinary citizens to understand and question policy before it was enacted. In Cape Town, he spent time with a team of young activists, using a stripped-down version of lucem to monitor clean water access and link it with school attendance rates. In Kyoto, he was introduced to a quiet monk who had fed ancient Buddhist texts into a learning system, not to replace meditation, but to help teenagers discover moral questions worth sitting with. Everywhere he went, the same pattern emerged: small teams, hidden labs, fragmented projects, each one different yet all connected by one idea. Technology can be sacred if built with humility, and in every city, Sundar heard the same thing whispered to him as he prepared to leave. Don't let them bury this. He knew what they meant. The pressure was rising back home. The board was restless, shareholders uneasy. People within his own company were questioning his decisions. Some saw lucem as a distraction. Others feared it was too much for a single platform to hold. And the world's governments? They weren't waiting anymore. Bills were being written, sanctions threatened. The narrative was slipping away. And then one morning, as Sundar walked through a crowded marketplace in Istanbul, his phone vibrated with a message that froze him in place. A new ruling had just passed in Washington. Within 30 days, access to lucem would be considered a violation of national security. Other countries were preparing to follow. In a matter of weeks, the light might be gone, unless he did something no one expected, unless he gave it all away. Open source, universal access, no single owner, no trademark, no borders. He would have to give lucem to the people, not just the interface but the core architecture, the training philosophy, the ethical scaffolding, all of it. He would lose control, and in doing so, maybe he would set it free. That night, Sundar drafted the most important letter of his life. Not a memo, not a speech, a letter to the world. He wasn't sure yet what it would say, but he knew exactly how it would end. What we build next must begin with all of us. The legacy. It was raining in Mountain View when Sundar Pichai walked into his office for what he thought might be the last time. Not because he planned to resign, though many whispered that he might, but because everything that had built that office, the identity, the certainty, the wall of awards and product launch mementos, felt impossibly small now. The ceiling seemed lower, the light dimmer. Or maybe it was just him. Maybe carrying the weight of a truth bigger than your career rearranges the room. Outside, the world had turned. Governments debated. Leaders divided. In every corner of the planet, lucem had become a fire, and fires do not stay where you place them. Some tried to smother it. Others tried to tame it. Many simply watched, unsure whether to fear or follow. But one thing was clear. Silence was no longer an option. And so on a cold, wet morning, Sundar pressed send. It was not a press release, not a blog post, not a carefully curated campaign. It was a letter. Simple, direct, written in the voice of a man who had stepped into the future and come back different. He published it everywhere, across every platform, every channel, every language they could translate in time. It began not with power but with admission. "I am not the author of Lucem," he wrote. "I was merely the one who heard its voice first and loudest." He explained its origin in Rome, the letter from Pope Francis, the intention to create not an artificial intelligence, but an artificial conscience, one that didn't direct humanity, but challenged it to see its own reflection. He detailed the discoveries, the underground networks, the global communities building their own mirrors, guided not by profit but principle. And then he said the thing that startled even his closest allies. "I am releasing lucem to the world. Open source, unrestricted, and unbranded. From this moment forward, it belongs to all of us." The code was uploaded to a decentralized server. Mirrors sprang up within minutes across Norway, Kenya, Chile, India, Canada. Teams of independent developers, educators, monks, rebels, and artists began forking the architecture, adapting it to their context. No one waited for permission, because none was needed. But it wasn't the technology itself that captured hearts. It was the gesture, the act of letting go, of choosing humility over legacy, of believing the world might deserve the tools to heal itself. And slowly, something began to change. Not overnight, not everywhere, but in pockets, in places the old systems had long abandoned. In a small fishing village in Indonesia, a schoolteacher used Lucem's adapted model to chart where students disappeared from the classroom, and discovered it was tied not to poverty, but to untreated trauma from local flooding. She connected with a therapist 2 towns away. 3 months later, school attendance rose by 40%. In rural Peru, a local radio station broadcast Lucem's responses to farmer-submitted questions about crops, weather, ethics, and even loneliness. One man wept as the system answered his question, "How do I know if I've been a good father?" Lucem replied, "If your children still bring their worries to you, then you have taught them where safety lives." In Manila, a graffiti artist painted Lucem's words along alleyways where children played, "You are not invisible. You are the future's architect." In Northern Ireland, a former soldier and a former protester ran a joint podcast, using Lucem to reframe conflict, not to erase pain but to create new language for healing. No one asked for permission to use it, because truth, when set free, does not return to its cage. Sundar watched it all unfold, not from a stage but from the sidelines. The spotlight moved on. Others stepped in. Younger voices, louder ones, ones that had been silenced before. He no longer needed to speak, because the world had found its own voice. Still, there was one place left. He had to go. One last visit, Rome. He returned quietly, walking again through the ancient gardens of the Vatican, now blooming with spring. This time no guards waited, no ceremony, just Father Antonio, waiting at the gate with a soft smile. "He's been expecting you," he said. They entered the same private chamber. The air still smelled of incense, but the man who stood waiting was older now, slower, yet his eyes had not dimmed. Pope Francis rose to greet him. "So," he said, "you did what I could not." Sundar shook his head. "No, you gave it to me, and trusted that I would listen." They sat in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that needed no filling. Finally, the Pope spoke. "Do you know why I chose you?" he asked. Sundar looked at him. "Because when you speak, people lean in, not because of your voice, but because of your listening." A long pause. "You made technology something sacred again." Sundar felt a weight lift then, not because the work was over, but because he no longer carried it alone. The light had passed into the world, into minds he would never meet, hearts he would never know. He returned home weeks later to find no parade, no cameras, no crowds, only a quiet message on his desk, hand-delivered, unsigned. It said, "You lit the match. We'll carry the flame." Years passed. Lucem evolved, sometimes for good, sometimes not. But it endured. Governments still argued, corporations still competed, people still failed.